the reporter Susan here?
Susan Hurt?
Yeah.
Sure should be here.
They did the best.
You want me to point out her? If I see her, I can point her to you.
Okay, y'all come back. Who's the reporter on this one?
David is here. I'm not sure who else. He's the gentleman with. Where is he? Right here. David.
Oh, okay, no, that's fine.
Right here. Ask him. He'll know for sure.
I know.
Folks, we're going to get started in just a minute here, so if you want to take a seat, that would be great. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Nels Jensen. I'm the editor of the Press Enterprise. Thank you for attending our forum on local air quality issues. This is a component of a project that was supported in part by a grant from the Lucille Packard Foundation for Children's Health Journalism, awarded by the California Endowment Health Journalism Fellowships at the UC Annenberg School of Journalism. Dave Danelski, where did Dave go? Dave Danelski is a veteran reporter for us at the Press Enterprise. He's covered many beats, but spent much of the past 12 years on environmental issues. He was the grant recipient and did the bulk of the work in our recently published series titled Air of Risk. There are copies of a couple of editions on the back table there. There's also a form if you'd like to subscribe to the Press Enterprise back there to help our wonderful business. If you want, you can leave information there and we'll contact you with information about that. And we'll hear from Dave shortly. But first I'd like to introduce our guest panel that we'll have after some presentations. Ed Abel is a professor of clinical medicine at USC's Keck School of Medicine. He's an expert on respiratory health, air pollution, and public health impacts of traffic. He's also the co-investigator of a 20-year children's health study, which followed the respiratory health of more than 5,000 children through Southern California, including some from the inland area. Kenneth Barenclaw is an associate professor of environmental economics and policy at UC Riverside. He'll talk about the economic pros and cons of industries as they relate to air quality. And Susan Nakamura is a planning and rules manager for the South Coast Air Quality Management District. She will explain the Air District's strategy to meet federal clean air guidelines. Here's our schedule for the evening. We'll begin with a 7-minute video that we produced for this project. Then Dave will give us a short presentation. We'll hear from each of our panelists for a 12 to 15-minute presentation. Then we'll open up the floor for questions. Our desire is to give everyone an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists and of Dave. Here are the ground rules. Please keep your questions as concise as possible. I can be pretty grumpy and relentless, so I won't hesitate to ask you to wrap up your question and make your point. And also, this is very important, this is not a referendum on the World Logistics Center or any other specific project. We are not here to listen to people voice their support or opposition to these such projects and proposals. There are other venues for that. And this is also not a forum to critique any individual developer, council, or agency. We're here to discuss health effects, economics, and policy questions related to inland air quality. There are a couple ways you can ask questions at the mic at the appropriate time. There's also some paper and pencil in the front row chairs if you want to write out a question.
federal health standard for fine particle pollution, which is a particularly toxic form of pollution. And there's a very large swath of the region, basically over Harupa Valley, Montana, and into San Bernardino, where hundreds of thousands of people live, and they don't, and the annual averages exceed the healthy level for particle pollution, which includes things like diesel soot.
If you come here at 5:30 in the morning and you just listen, all you hear is trucks and bulldozers and horns. That's all you hear at 5:30 in the morning. And you didn't hear that a couple of years ago.
The other thing we found out is that children are more vulnerable than adults, and that's basically because their bodies are growing. They're building organs, and the pollution, when it gets into their bodies, basically interferes with the growing process. One of the outcomes that's been pretty well established is that their lungs are weaker, or they don't have quite the lung capacity as kids who grow up in clean air. We went into some neighborhoods in the inland area where people get a higher dose of pollution. One was near a rail yard in San Bernardino. The other was a neighborhood surrounded by warehouses in Harupa Valley. And that neighborhood had just a lot of truck traffic all around it from the trucks serving the warehouses. In both these neighborhoods, it was rather remarkable that most of the people we talked to had a lot of respiratory symptoms similar to having a cold, runny noses, headaches, watery eyes, and things like that. And also, most of the families we talked to had asthma or other respiratory conditions going on in their families. Loma Linda University conducted interviews and a health screening of children who live near the rail yard in San Bernardino and found remarkably high asthma levels among those children.
I'm sorry. Like, I don't want her to feel that it's her fault, or like, because she didn't do anything wrong. That as her mother, I can't do anything to take it away, to make her feel better. It sucks.
Areas with air pollution result in higher frequencies of diseases like asthma, and also make such conditions worse for the families that suffer them. We've talked to several families who believe that air pollution is making the situations worse for their children. One example was I talked to a woman who had to take away her son's trampoline because when he jumped on the trampoline, he would start coughing, and that could trigger an asthma attack.
She says her little boy, when he's out running around and he starts to run around too much, then he starts coughing. The coughing starts agitated outside. So she doesn't let him go out too often.
While the inland region has severe air pollution problems, it is also facing tremendous economic pressure to develop warehouses. The warehouses are needed to meet the demands of cargo arriving from the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Since 2010, there's been more than 100 million square feet of warehouses proposed for Southern California. 97% of that square footage is thought for Riverside and San Bernardino counties. One project called the World Logistics Center would bring roughly 41 million square feet to the city of Moreno Valley. Industry leaders say that these facilities are needed to create tens of thousands of jobs that are needed. Industry officials are providing needed jobs. They're doing their best to reduce air pollution, and that many of the air pollution concerns might be overblown. They are under tremendous pressure already from regulators to reduce pollution. For example, the California Air Resources Board is requiring older trucks to be retrofitted with filters that greatly reduce pollution. This is coming at great cost to the industry. Retrofitting these trucks costs anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000, according to trucking officials. Warehouse industry proponents say it provides needed jobs for people who don't have college education, and that helps reduce poverty.
These are the displays that we're building for customers. These will go to Walmart for floor displays. So, oh yeah. We'll do these. I think we have like over the next 4 weeks, we have like 20 different displays we're going to be building.
Many of these projects are opposed by communities who don't want to see pollution and traffic increase in their neighborhoods.
I specifically moved from LA County to get away from the pollution. And I came here and I feel like I'm being forced out again because I can't stay with my daughter. Is going to be put in a position where I'm going to have to go back and forth to a hospital again.
Can you hear me? Can't see the slide. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? One of the major points of this was, as we said in the video, that air pollution has greatly improved since the 70s, but we're not there yet. And this just illustrates, this is last year's number of days by community for ozone pollution. Ozone is a corrosive gas that triggers asthma attacks. It's been associated with early deaths and other health effects. And as you can see, the region will meet the federal health standard when there's no more than 2 of these a year and anywhere in Southern California. So, as I said before, for ozone pollution, we're still have a long way to go. Next slide, please. And the same thing can be said for PM pollution. In the past decade, the levels of fine particle pollution, which includes soot and wood smoke and dust and things like that, it came down a lot, but we still have a very large area of the inland area that fails to meet the health standard. There's a similar but smaller area in Los Angeles County as well, kind of around the 710 area. And as this graphic shows, we have people who are with health problems who are living in these areas. Next slide, please. The bottom line is the health effects. What I found, one of the biggest challenges of this project was when the EPA came up with the new health standard for particle pollution back in December. They put out a paper that cited thousands of studies. Ed Alvo was part of the committee that reviewed the various science to help the EPA set health standards, and he could talk about just the vastness of the research. And what's kind of complicated about it is there's a lot of studies come out, and they come out every week, and one study doesn't really prove anything. For example, there'll be a study saying that there's a risk for autism or some brain effect, but as time goes on, more and more studies come out that confirm earlier studies. And so in the red, these are the health effects that have been pretty well established through multiple studies, over many years. And as you can see, a shorter life, stroke, heart disease, asthma, cancer, reduced lung function. And the ones in blue are kind of the new areas of discovery.
some of these might not pan out, but what impressed me in going through all the scientific literature is that when scientists look at air pollution, they keep coming up with bad news about it. They keep finding more things it does to the body, and as time goes on, there's a sidebar I did in the project, and basically what they're saying is that the air pollution gets deep into the cells of our organs, and it basically messes with our biochemistry, and that can set the path for not just one disease, but multiple disease paths, which I think is something very significant. That's, if you were to kind of combine it all and say, well, what do these studies tell us collectively? So next slide, please. And you get more effect of air pollution with a bigger dose, and people living near roadways get a bigger dose. And these are studies that specifically looked at health effects for people living near freeways. And as you can see, there's cancer, heart disease, asthma, low birth weight, autism, which is again relatively new, and reduced lung function in children. And at the bottom, you'll see the citations for the various studies that we used to develop that graphic. Next slide, please. And now at the same time, on the economic side, Southern California, ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles are very much on the rise. They've been expanded. They're expecting more goods, and this is the projections. And next slide, please. And so all the goods coming in from the ports need to be warehoused. And this slide is particularly interesting to me because it shows where since 2010, this is where the warehouses have been proposed. The 37% is just one project sought for Moreno Valley, the World Logistics Center. And so, the inland region has the available land, and so that's where they want to develop them. Next slide, please. And of course, it's very important to understand both sides of this coin. Since beginning in 2012, there's been more than 5,000 jobs in what's called the logistics sector. Warehousing is a component of that, but it also includes transportation and wholesale trade. And I'll just part with this note. Have a serious unemployment problem in our region, and Moreno Valley especially has very high unemployment, and those numbers pretty much speak for themselves. We lag the rest of the state, and we definitely lag the nation. And that's all I have to say now. So, Ed, do you want to?
Press Enterprise. Well, thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you. I was asked to say a little bit about children's health and try to point out some of the reasons why we're concerned about children's health. So next slide. For those of you who go to the back of the book and try to find how things turn out before you read the whole book, here's the final story. And that is that early life changes have lifelong consequences, and the choices that you're going to make in the next couple of years actually affect not only the health of your children, but also the general public's health. So be mindful of get the best available information when you make those choices. Next slide. So now back to the beginning. I want to say a little bit about air pollution. I want to talk a little bit about air pollution health effects. Tell you a little bit why it's different for children, and then why this all matters. Next slide. Dave already mentioned something about air pollution. The point here is that there are thousands of chemicals in the air every day. Some of them are directly emitted. They come right from a source. Those are known as primary emissions, and they're in the air every day. And then because of the intense solar radiation, the ultraviolet sunlight that we have here, chemicals combine and cook in the air, and we have new chemicals, new pollutant forms in the air, and those are known as secondary pollutants. And it's both those primary and secondary pollutants that may have different kinds of health effects. We're interested in both those things. So it's sort of a complicated story. There are lots of things going on in the air, and there are thousands of chemicals chemicals in the air. Next slide. In California, in Southern California particularly, because we have such a large population, we tend to always think about everything in terms of vehicle exhaust. And that certainly is true. We have millions and millions of cars and trucks and other things here. Next slide. But thinking about exhaust and emissions, it's more than just cars. We have the 2 largest ports in the country. We have several large airports. We have a huge cargo movement industry. And so all those activities, we have construction going on, those off-road activities, all those things in terms of engines and exhaust are components of the issue and components of the concern here. So don't think about it just in terms of cars. It's a much bigger picture than that. Next slide. Well, you know from many studies that have been done that things in terms of exposure are very different close to the roadside. And as you go away just a few hundred meters from the roadside, the concentration from the road changes dramatically. So certain kinds of particles, certain kinds of gases, the concentration is much higher at the roadside and then drops off very quickly. And there's sort of this curve where different gases are shown here, different particles are shown here. But the point is that within this few hundred meters of the road, very close to the road, the exposures can be quite different. So being close to the road means something different in terms of exposure. Next slide. We have lots of roads here. I don't think I have to sell you on that notion. Next slide. And as Dave pointed out, we have many, many people that live within a mile or so of busy roads. And so in terms of the potential exposures, we have a lot of people that are potentially exposed to these higher concentrations close to the road. Next slide. About now 15 years ago, the state of California identified diesel exhaust as a potential human carcinogen. Just last year, the World Health Organization looked at the data up until that time, and in the last 15 years, there's been a lot of information collected, additional information provided, and decided there was sufficient information to declare diesel exhaust as a known carcinogen. And so it's in the same category now, according to the World Health Organization, as something like asbestos, in terms of possibly causing cancer. Next slide. I want to say a few words about air pollution and health and some of the issues with children. Next slide. As Dave pointed out, there's a lot known. I looked to search in one of the online survey activities that one could look at the medical literature, and there are over 22,000 articles published on different aspects of health. And here are some of the endpoints, different outcomes, everything that have to do with your heart, your respiratory system, your brain, activities, changes in blood levels, just a whole range of things. We'll talk about just a few of these things in the next couple of minutes. Next slide. The other question is not only is there the opportunity for exposure, but aren't there special components of the population that are especially at risk? Are some people at more risk than others? And if they are, can we identify who those people are and why they are at risk? And if you'll click one more. In fact, we can. We know something about them, and I want to talk about at least one of them. Next slide. So children turn out to be a susceptible group, and there are a couple of reasons why that is. Next slide. First of all, children are not just little adults. They're quite different for a number of reasons, and I want to point out some of those reasons now. Next slide. They're different from us on several levels. Next click, please. In terms of exposure, they tend to spend more time outdoors. They tend to run around, be more active than you or I for the most part. And so their exposure, their potential for exposure, they breathe more. Their potential for exposure is much higher than you or I. Next slide. Physiologically speaking, they have higher ventilation rates. They breathe more per unit mass for their body size. And they have different lung deposition patterns. The diameters of their airways, the size of their lungs are different from fully grown lungs. And so because of that different size, particles land in different places, gases go to different places, and they do, and have different impacts, potentially, than they might for adults. And so it's different on that. And then Dave mentioned they are growing. And we know that when biological units are growing, when organs are developing, changes that happen while they're growing may affect that growth. Next slide. Please, next clip. Thank you. In terms of being simpler to understand some of the things, they don't have some of the complications you and I have. By and large, they don't have occupational exposure, so we don't have to worry about what they've been breathing at work or in the workplace. And if we study them early enough, they generally don't smoke. And so we don't have the confounding issues of whether smoking has caused the problem or whether occupational exposure has. And one more click, please. Finally, and perhaps more vexing, they don't undertake personal protective behavior. You and I may know that when it's hot or when it's smoggy outside, we shouldn't be over-exercising ourselves, we should be resting. Young children don't realize this. They go out and run around and can't understand why they don't feel well. In addition, we may choose to take some sort of personal protective behavior, and in the occupational sense, for example, that might be wearing a mask to avoid dusty exposure. But children don't know that and don't have immediate access to that thing. So they don't undertake the personal protection that one might. Next slide. This is a study done at UCLA looking at pregnant mothers that live close to busy roadway and showing that, in fact, the chances of increased risk associated with preterm, low birth weight and preterm birth is associated with the concentration of number of trucks passing by their homes. And so it looks like, at least from these early studies, and there have been several of them since then, that the higher number of trucks that pass by, the larger number of heavy-duty diesel that comes by, there seems to be an association with the frequency of preterm and low birth weight births. Next slide. We're interested here at USC, we've been following, as it was mentioned, the Children's Health Study for over 20 years now, looking at the growth and respiratory health of California school children, trying to understand something about how they grow and what might affect their growth. Now, we know a lot now about their respiratory health. And next slide. And as it turns out, children that grow up in higher pollution areas have slower growing lungs. Now, the amount of that decline is about 1%, 1.5% a year. But over the course of the many years that they're growing, that accumulates, and that becomes a big deal after 8 or 10 or 12 years of losing 1% or 1.5% each year. And so the dots here, the dark dots represent boys in each of 12 communities, so each of those dots represents several hundred individuals, and the open circles are girls, but the message is the same. For increasing levels of pollution going from left to right, the levels are going up, their lung function is going down. So their lungs are smaller if they live in higher pollution places by the time they're age 18, their lungs are growing. Next slide. We also know from similar studies that those children that are experiencing the biggest loss are those who live closest to busy roadways. So those that live within 500 meters or so, about a quarter mile of the freeway, are the ones that are losing lung function the fastest, the largest losses. Next slide. The other interesting thing, though, is it's not just a local issue. This slide shows that if you live in a high polluted place, it's identified as high PM 2.5, so high particulates and near a freeway, that's sort of the worst of all situations. The biggest loss there, compared to the others, the light blue on the other side, which is in a relatively clean place far away from the freeway. The interesting thing here is not those two extremes, rather the two plots in the middle, the yellow slide. What that says is if you live in a clean place, but near a freeway, you have about the same lung function loss as a child as someone who lives in a more polluted environment, but far away from a freeway. And that is, there's a local and a regional effect. So there's some impact of both. Being close to a source that's significant pollution is a problem, but also being an area that has generally poor air quality is also a problem and makes that condition worse. So both of those makes it doubly, not doubly, but both of those makes it even worse. Yes, next slide. Why do we care about growth rates? This is a stylized cartoon that shows your growth, your lung growth, over the course of your lifetime. We all grow until we're about, your lungs grow to the early 20s, then they level off, and then we start to decline about 1% or so a year, maybe a little more if we've been a smoker, if you have some genetic predisposition, if you've been exposed occupationally or for some reason, a little faster, a little slower, but we all lose lung function. If you get off to a poor start, you don't get that high on the curve, and you tend to be the first ones off the back on the other side. Next slide. And so we know from studies that have been done that if you have a poor start and have poor lung function throughout your life, you're at higher risk for heart disease, higher risk for respiratory disease, and higher risk for early death. And so looking at your lung function growth through the first half of your life tells us something about what the second half is likely to be like. Next slide. There have been a number of studies done to look at asthma and air pollution. And asthma is a disease that unfortunately many people suffer from occasionally. In between, they may seem fine, but during that asthmatic event, it can actually be life-threatening at times. Next slide. If you already have asthma, being in an air pollution area makes it worse. So you tend to have more bronchitis, more symptoms, need more medication. Next slide. Even if you don't have asthma, and you're, for example, a young child playing in a lot of outdoor sports, if you're in an air pollution area, an area of higher pollution, being in an area of higher pollution and playing a lot of outdoor sports and just exposing yourself to this over the course of several years puts you at higher risk to develop the asthma. So it's not just that it makes it worse if you have the disease, it actually is the case that it may cause and propel you forward into the disease state. Next slide. And those that live closest to the freeway, again, this message of being close to the point of source, those who live closest seem to be at higher risk. So this is within 75 meters, but you can see that the risk above 1 is increased risk. And so they're about anywhere up to about 50% higher risk on average being close have been other studies, most recently done, just actually in the last month was published, a study looking at several thousand children across the United States, minority children, Hispanic, Latino, African American, and seeing these same sort of issues in large populations of previously understudied children. So we see these same sort of things that in areas of higher pollution, the pollution seems to contribute to the prevalence of asthma. We are doing a lot of studies now, and there's a lot of interest in cognitive function, and whether behavior, learning ability is affected by air pollution. And there's some interesting work coming out. Next slide. One of my colleagues, Heather Volk, recently published an article showing that for this, looking at this, the birth of children across California and subsequent diagnosis of autism and where the mother, the pregnant mother, had lived during the course of that pregnancy, and children whose parents had lived within a mile of the freeway were at almost a 90% increased risk for developing autism compared to those that lived at least a mile or so away. Now, this is admittedly still preliminary data. It's one of several studies now that have been published looking at autism. We continue to try and understand what is driving this increased autism, which was a relatively rare disease, about 1 in 150 children until maybe 5 or 10 years ago, and now, for a number of reasons, seems to be more prevalent. This is another look at a more recent autism study, and the important part here is the top right quadrant, so the part above the solid black line, which is a risk above 1, so there's something going on, and to the right towards me of the dotted line, which are pollutants that have been identified, heavy metals and diesel, flip the slide please, and diesel, showing that in that upper right quadrant, these are statistically significant findings for looking at what might be in dust where we see excess risk for autism. Next slide. And there have been studies like this done around the world. We're not just seeing this here in this country. We're not just seeing it in Los Angeles or just in 1 or 2 places. These are studies done in Europe, done in China, done on the East Coast, and actually this one is in Cincinnati, I'm sorry, showing that exposure to traffic-related pollutants do seem to have measurable effects on behavior and patterns, growth patterns, behavioral patterns, and behavior in the classroom, actually. Next slide. So, in summary, I've run you through this, but hopefully you've gathered that children chronically exposed to vehicle exhaust have lower lung function, more asthma, require more medication, are more wheezy, and seem to be having more behavior, learning, and cognitive function issues. Next slide. The point is that early life consequences may have long-lasting results. Much like the tree, you start out as a young sapling in your backyard, the wind sort of blows it, it starts to grow at a curve. This is what we're concerned about with children. Things happen to their exposure, affects them while they're growing. That could have to be a lifelong event. Next slide. Ultimately, you're going to be faced with a lot of decisions. We all have to make choices about where you live, about where you work, about how your city develops. The best thing you can do is get the available information and make informed choices. But be aware that choices you make do affect both your family and those around you. And so try to keep present the notion that public health, next slide, ought to be a part of the discussion when you think about it. Thank you. Next slide. I think I'm done. Next slide. There we go. But we're not taking
Okay, thank you all for coming out tonight. It's great to see that there's some interest and concern about these issues. My name is Ken Berenklau. I'm an associate professor at UC Riverside, and I'm an environmental economist by training. I was asked to come out tonight not because I've done a lot of research on the economics of air pollution and air quality in particular, but instead to give you an introduction to a branch of economics that's called non-market valuation, and talk about how we can use techniques to actually place economic values on things like cleaner or dirtier air quality, or basically almost any other type of environmental amenity. So, if you go back one slide for me. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about, what economists, how we define this term value, what we mean by economic value, give you a few examples, some of which I may skip through in the interest of time, but be sure to focus on one with regard to placing economic value on improved air quality, and then talk about the rationale for incorporating these values into the planning process. So hopefully I'll be able to get through all of that. Next slide, please. So first, three things that I want you to keep in mind as I go through this. First is that environmental economists are welfare economists. That doesn't mean that we study government programs to provide income to people who are out of work. It means we're concerned about social welfare, all right? And we use the term welfare to mean well-being. So we think of well-being in a much broader sense than just private income that might be earned by firms and industry, but a much broader sense of people's satisfaction with life and the value that they place on different things that affect their well-being. We use monetary units to measure value, okay? So we talk a lot about money, but we don't necessarily focus on, in fact, we try not to focus on valuing things that clearly have prices attached to them. That's part of what we do, but in fact, we want to look much broader and try to value things that don't necessarily have prices attached to them. The last point, which I've kind of already said, is that we seek to maximize social value. So profits earned by firms, your own individual income, and those types of more easily measurable components of social welfare are certainly something that we're concerned about, but so is air quality, so is water quality, so is species preservation, open space, outdoor recreation, and all these types of things that we don't necessarily buy and sell in markets, but I think we can all agree contribute to our quality of life. Next slide, please. So first, what do we mean by value when a welfare economist talks about value? This is a simple word that economists have given a very specific definition to in order so that we can use it rigorously in quantitative analysis. What we mean by value is that if you value something, you're probably willing to make a sacrifice to obtain it, right? If you're not willing to make any sacrifice to obtain something, you probably don't place any value on it. And so the value that you place on any good or service, whether or not you buy it in a market or not, is defined as the largest sacrifice you make to obtain that good rather than go without it. Okay? And we can apply this concept of value regardless of whether or not the good or service that we're talking about is bought and sold in the market. Now, how do we measure this sacrifice? Well, the easiest way to measure it might be, if you think about a barter economy, all the goods and services that you would have to trade in order to get the one good that you're trying to get. But that's a pretty unwieldy measure or way to measure value. And so instead, what we do, which we've done for many, many generations now in our economy, is we convert things into a monetary equivalent, generalized purchasing power or money. So we use money to measure value, right? We ask someone, what's the most you'd be willing to sacrifice or give up to obtain this good, whether it be a tank of gasoline or a nicer view of the mountains. And that value may be very different from the price that is paid for a good, okay? It's typically much significantly greater than the price that we pay, and that's exactly why we choose to consume it. It gives us value that is greater than the sacrifice that we have to make in order to obtain it. So keep that definition in mind as we go along. We call this willingness to pay. Your willingness to pay to obtain something is the value that you place on it. Next slide, please. So, how does this relate to environmental issues? I've kind of been alluding to this as I go along. Well, welfare economists, environmental economists in particular, believe that environmental amenities should be valued in exactly the same way as any other good or service that affects our well-being, right? So if I enjoy hiking in the mountains, that contributes to my well-being, and I should be able to place a value on it in dollar terms, just the same way as buying a new suit, right? That contributes to my well-being as well. So environmental economists, when they look at, let's say, a piece of bare land here in the Inland Empire, we think there's all different kinds of ways that this land could be used. We could develop it, build houses on it, preserve it for visitors like recreation, or preserve it for species and try to keep people away from it. And all of these different uses produce costs and benefits for society. And our goal is to try to do the most thorough accounting of those costs and benefits as we can before we decide exactly how to use that particular piece of land, all right? Neglecting environmental values, neglecting the value of cleaner air or cleaner water or the supply of groundwater, let's say, or the view of our local mountains, tends to bias our decisions against conservation of natural resources and towards development. The reason is because if we don't place values on those goods and services, they appear to be free. No one's asking you for compensation if you diminish the air quality. So why should you really care diminishing the air quality. Instead, you focus on producing other measurable values. So this is the risk in neglecting to put prices and values on environmental amenities, is that they tend to then fall by the wayside in the planning process. Next slide, please. So with land use planning, we could do this little thought experiment, right? If you go back a couple hundred years before there was any development really in the Los Angeles area, we have all of this land in a pristine state. And it would be pretty hard to argue against developing at least something, right? Putting schools and hospitals and businesses and homes and things that would clearly be raising the quality of life for the inhabitants, right? But at some point, most people would probably say we're there or we're getting there. We reach the point where additional development starts to create tangible and significant costs based on how it impacts the environment. So too much development then becomes harmful, right? And harmful in ways that might be external to the market. So if we could find that balancing point where the benefit of developing another parcel of land starts to outweigh the cost, that's sort of the right balance that we would be searching for. That would maximize social welfare. It's a hard thing to do, and it's even harder when you consider the uncertainties that we have about how our environment works and even how our economy works. But environmental economists believe that we can make headway towards finding the right balance by applying statistical tools and economic theory to try to uncover the values that people implicitly attach to things like air quality. Next slide, please. So I think what I might do in the interest of time is, well, I'll talk about this one, but I'm going to skip the next two slides and go to the last case study. I want to give you a few examples from the academic literature on attempts to value ecosystem services. And I put this one up because it's really one of a kind. Robert Costanza, who was a faculty member at University of Maryland when he wrote the study, and maybe a dozen colleagues attempted to place a value on the world's ecosystem services, right, outside of our standard market economy. And they basically borrowed figures from the literature that other people had supplied for different specific environmental services. They extrapolated them to different landscapes, and they came up with this number, $33 trillion per year would be the aggregate value of the world's ecosystem services. You can compare that to global GDP in the year that they published their study, which was substantially less than the value of the ecosystem services. Now, people reacted to this study, it got a lot of press. Proponents of the study found that, well, they could really only defend it because it cast a light on a much-needed subject. Detractors of the study could find a lot of ways to pick it apart, and even the authors themselves were very upfront about the limits of the study. But I think the best reaction was the one at the bottom here. There's a think tank in Washington, D.C. called Resources for the Future, and they said that 33 trillion was a serious underestimate of infinity. And that was really not entirely tongue-in-cheek when you think about it, because if the value of something is the maximum sacrifice we would make to obtain it, I think we would all sacrifice everything in order to keep the planet functioning in a way that we can live here. That's the idea, right? So let's skip the next couple slides and go to one more. There. Now this was a more relevant study for the topic of today. I believe his first name is Kurt. Kurt Viren and some co-authors about 12 years ago now used a method called the hedonic pricing method to attempt to tease out the value of air quality in the greater Los Angeles area. Okay? Now, there are different ways to go about doing this, but what the hedonic pricing method normally focuses on is kind of the same thing that an assessor would do for your home, right? They collect a lot of data on home characteristics, neighborhood characteristics, whatever they think is going to affect the market price of a home. And importantly, in this case, they collect additional data on ozone and particulates and visibility. Okay, 3 different measures of air quality around Los Angeles that differ spatially throughout the basin. And they run what's called a 2-stage statistical analysis. The first thing that they do is they attempt to see if home prices are impacted by air quality after you control for all those other home characteristics that typically affect its price, like the quality of the schools, the incidence of crime, how convenient is it to urban centers where jobs are, how many bedrooms does it have, when was it built, does it have a pool, all that kind of stuff. And they get some interesting results. The first 3 results here are from their first stage analysis. So they find that if they were to improve visibility or increase visibility by about 1 mile, which in their data set is like a 7% improvement in visibility, That tends to increase the price of the average home by between 3 and 8%. So you can take whatever you think is the market price of your home, you can multiply it by, I don't know, roughly 5%, let's say, and that would be their prediction for how the value of your home would change given changes in average visibility in your neighborhood. It might go up if the visibility increases, it might go down if it decreases. They also looked at ozone. A 1 part per million, or in their data set that amounts to about a 14% increase in the average daily maximum ozone level, decreases the price of a home by roughly the same, 2 to 7%. Okay? We've seen pretty substantial changes in ozone concentrations around here through the decades. And so you can also think about what the effect on home values has been thanks to that reduction in daily maximum ozone. The third one looked at total suspended particulates. A 1 part per million increase decreases the price of a home by less than 1%. So that one's not quite as significant as the others. The last thing that they did, after they looked at how home prices are impacted by environmental quality, is they went one step further and invoked this concept of value and said, okay, it's one thing to say how much the price of a good will change when its attributes change. And in this case, the attributes were the air quality features of these homes. It's something else to say how much people are willing to pay or how much they value that change. So what they found was that a 20% increase in visibility, and this just happened to be the one simulation that they did with their data set, they could have done others, increases household welfare by about between $1,000 and $3,000 annually in 1995 dollars. So what that means is that over and above these changes in prices that we're seeing in homes, this would be a measure of the economic value that people would receive from a 20% increase in visibility, or conversely, a measure of the economic damage that they would suffer if visibility were to decrease by 20%. Okay? Not an insignificant amount. If you think about having that additional amount of money on hand every year, not insignificant. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is it important to do these types of analyses, and how might this air quality analysis influence public policy? Well, environmental services typically are not represented in markets. Okay? As I said, it's hard to find someone who's out there selling cleaner air, right? We don't go and purchase a certain quantity of air every day that we want to consume at a certain quality, right? We just go outside and start breathing it. It's a non-market good. So, therefore, individuals can't demand compensation when these goods are diminished, right? If you want to purchase some of the good that I sell, which is education at UC Riverside, you have to pay some compensation for that. But if you want to diminish the air quality in some way, unless you're a regulated entity, you can get away with that for free, right? And when things are free, and when they're priced at very low prices, people tend to use more of them, right? So when air quality looks like it's a free input to a production process, more air quality gets used up. Same thing happens when labor prices go down. More labor gets used, right? When capital prices go down, more capital gets used. When people think that water and air are almost free, a lot of water and air gets used up, right? So therefore, we have what's called, what economists tend to refer to as market failure. Markets fail to allocate natural resources and other resources to their most valuable uses. So what that means is that it essentially motivates, it provides a rationale for government agencies to intervene and regulate markets in order to produce outcomes that have greater levels of social welfare, right? That account not only for the private profits of firms and the measurable welfare that individuals receive from market transactions, but also from these non-market goods and services, all right? Now, one way to do this, and one way that economists like to do this, is not to tell people exactly what to do, but instead to, kind of an obvious approach, place a price on these goods and services that were not previously priced, okay? So if we could come up with an appropriate price for every unit of air quality that someone diminishes, and if we could actually figure out a mechanism for charging them for diminishing air quality, then they'll begin to treat air quality as a valuable and scarce commodity in whatever production process is causing it to be used up. And we therefore hope that people would conserve more air quality when they're asked to pay for it. Right? There are many other ways to go about regulating air quality, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that in just a minute. But economists tend to prefer these We'll take our hands off and let you decide exactly what you want to do, but you have to pay for those environmental services just like you have to pay for labor, just like you have to pay for fuel, just like you have to pay for spare parts. Next slide, please. So some closing remarks then. Just to reinforce the main message here. Environmental service values are real and often significant, just as in that case study I presented to you, and can help planners make the most of a region by appropriately balancing development with conservation. I will grant that it's easy to say that and it's hard to do in practice, but nonetheless, environmental economists feel that we can make a lot of headway if we will adopt some of these valuation methods and if policymakers are willing to listen to the estimates that we give them. In order to do that, we need information both on the environmental service values, which is what I was just talking to you about. You know, how much does a change in air quality impact welfare? How much does it change market prices for goods and services? We also need to know what the impacts of development are on those environmental services in order to charge an appropriate fee, let's say, for each unit of environmental quality that gets used up. Incorporating these values into land use planning is particularly useful in early stages of development before a lot of costly and irreversible investments get made. So my message to you today is that the next time you feel frustrated by an environmental problem, whatever it might be, whether it's air pollution, water pollution, whether it's the loss of your favorite outdoor recreation area, and that sort of thing, think about it in terms of market failure. That these environmental goods and services appear to be free, they're unpriced, and therefore they tend to be overused. And the direct way to dealing with that is to try to produce prices that we can attach to these goods and services in the hopes that people will treat them more like scarce market commodities. Okay? So thank you very much. I'll take questions later.
Good evening, my name is Susan Nakamura. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the South Coast Air Quality Management District. Go to the next slide, please. I wanted to first, and I think a lot of you probably know about our agency, but I wanted to, for those that are not familiar with our agency, is that we're a four-county agency responsible for air pollution. We cover the counties of Orange County, the urban portions of Los Angeles, Riverside, and San Bernardino. Our key responsibilities are primarily stationary sources. The state and the federal, state being the California Air Resources Board and the federal being the Environmental Protection Agency are responsible for many of the mobile sources. We have responsibilities to comply with state and federal air quality standards. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards we refer as the NAAQS, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Our agency has a comprehensive air toxics program covering a wide variety of different sources and air toxics. We permit sources, inspect businesses, and we also have responsibilities under, I think many of you know, it's called the California Environmental Quality Act. And under CEQA, we are responsible and a commenting agency. I wanted to this is the agency's mission, and I just wanted to highlight some of the key points here is that we believe that everyone has a right to live and work in an environment of clean air, and that we have a responsibility to protect public health from air pollution. And our actions, we're sensitive to the impacts of our actions on the community and businesses. I think Dave already highlighted for us, in terms of the key pollutants that I'm going to highlight tonight, fine particulates, PM2.5, and ozone. I think Dave also kind of alluded to some of the building blocks or the precursors to these. And one of the ones that we're probably going to focus a little more on is NOx. So I think Ed had a slide that was similar to this in terms of the relationship here. So we have a variety of different sources that emit pollution. Next click. They produce air pollution, and then there's the potential, next click, health impacts, depending on the type of pollution that we're looking at. Next slide. Next slide. So I wanted to go over a little bit, and the good news is that that the air quality trend is a downward trend. So when we look at the air quality trend overall for particulate matter and ozone over the last 2 decades, we've definitely seen the downward trend. Next slide. The not so good news is that when we look into the areas of for PM 2.5, we do see a higher concentration at the Mira Loma station. And as EPA, they promulgated a new standard for PM 2.5, which will decrease the standard. We're going to see an even broader impact of that PM 2.5 impact. So right now the standard is 15, which is the dotted outline. The standard's going to go to 12, so the outer outline's 10, so it's going to be a broader impact, which creates more challenges for our agency. In regards to the 8-hour ozone standard, this shows the number of exceedances in 2012. I think Dave had already highlighted that there's been over 100 exceedances in 2012. I think if you look at this slide, it's the purple, the dark pink, and the orange, which represents the higher number of exceedances, and those generally are occurring in the Inland Empire and San Bernardino and Riverside. In regards to air toxics, we have done 3 MATE studies, the multiple air toxics exposure study. All of these studies have shown similar results in regards to elevated risks in the Inland Empire. The good news is that the Inland Empire doesn't have the highest risk. The not so good news is that the risk is still upwards towards 1,000 and a million in some areas. The greatest contribution to the risk is diesel particulate, and it tends to follow the major transportation corridors. So I wanted to highlight some of the challenges ahead. The port puts out a forecast. The current forecast that we've looked at is that if you look over from 2012 to 2035, the anticipation of growth in cargo is over 250%. A substantial amount of growth coming from the ports. Next slide. And this is actually from SCAG, their projections in terms of the amount of warehousing needed to support the growth in cargoes. And so the amount of growth anticipated for warehousing to support the containers, 412 million square feet. You know, we don't know specifically where it's going to go, but there's been indication that there's going to be substantial growth in the Inland Empire for warehousing. There's also challenges for the criteria pollutants. We have not only the regional ambient air quality standards that we need to achieve, but I think Ed had really highlighted and done a good job in talking about these near source and the near roadway impacts that we also have to be mindful of. Also, there's the multiple and ever-moving targets that EPA puts out for us. And so the challenges and the hurdles become even greater for our agency and for the area. And so some of the strategies of what we're looking at is that there's a wide variety of things that our agency is currently doing and that we're working towards. Next slide. So the air quality management plan, we update our air quality management plan generally every 3 years. The 2015 AQMP, we've already started the process for that one. That one, it will focus heavily on the ozone standard, the 8-hour ozone standard. We anticipate to achieve the 8-hour ozone standard that we will need upwards towards a 90% reduction in NOx. The focus will be on NOx because it will address not only the ozone standard, but also for the PM 2.5 standard. What's going to be needed in terms of achieving that standard is that the use of zero and near zero emission technologies, and that we're really working with other agencies in terms of a very integrated process and program. The California Air Resources Board is working on a goods movement program. We're working with them. We're working with SCAG on their RTIP, but we're really looking at trying to have systematic solutions to achieve these standards. So knowing that we're going to have what we would refer to as a NOx-heavy strategy, looking at the top 5 NOx sources in 2023, on the top of the list is heavy-duty diesel trucks. Then next is off-road equipment, ships, commercial boats. Stationary sources are 4th on the list, and then locomotives. Another program that we have is called our Clean Communities Plan. under this program, it includes a number of measures, and it has a pilot study. And the AQMD has been conducting a pilot study in 2 communities, Boyle Heights and San Bernardino. We've put a lot of resources in terms of grants and programs, and tried to identify solutions, and now we're at the point of trying to prioritize and put together a report for this. And this is a busy slide, but what we wanted to highlight here is just the amount of money and funds and effort that we've been directing towards the Inland Empire. There's been a number of Prop 1B programs. We've worked with CCAJ to put in air filtration projects for schools and recreation centers. We have an airshed grant with EPA. We just held it's called an auto body workshop that was in San Bernardino, where we were literally giving away brake cleaning systems that were worth $900. We also have a wood fireplace and stove replacement program that's targeted for the Mira Loma and the San Bernardino area. So our agency has a responsibility under CEQA to provide comments, and we review CEQA documents, we review EIRs, NEGDECs, and we provide comments to lead agencies. And our review of these CEQA documents is looking at the technical information. Do they do the emission calculations? Do they do the air quality analysis? Because CEQA is really a public disclosure document, letting the public know what the potential impacts are from a particular project. And the key land use developments in the Inland Empire have been warehousing, housing developments, transportation infrastructure projects. Next slide. And so our agency, if the impacts are significant, we provide recommendations for mitigation measures. And so we wanted to highlight for warehouses some of the mitigation measures that we generally recommend. In terms of the CEQA documents for warehouses, it's come a long way. I guess it was, 10, 15 years ago when I think it was Riverside County was doing EIRs, or wasn't even doing an EIR, NEGDECs, and everything was going under the wire. Now we're seeing warehouses, many projects that not only do they incorporate the Riverside COG Good Neighbor Guidelines that our agency, CCAJ, had worked on, the COG had worked on, but they're doing EIRs and they're looking at the health impacts from those. But there's still a ways to go. When we see these projects, if the impacts are significant, sometimes these warehouses are near homes and schools and neighborhoods. We recommend all of these mitigation measures. So some of the things that I wanted to highlight is, for example, clean truck fleets. That there's dedicated truck routes that are away from homes and schools. That there's, that at least if they're not implementing zero emission technologies, that they include the infrastructure for zero and near zero technology. So CNG fueling stations, the plugs for electric trucks. We want to see solar, buffer zones to protect sensitive receptors. So in conclusion, I just wanted to wrap up and highlight for our air district and for this air region to achieve the air quality goals, we know that we will need a substantial amount of zero and near zero emission technologies. I wanted to make it very clear, our agency is not against growth. Our agency, we do our air quality management plan, and the plan is growth accommodating. It includes the SCAG's growth forecast. It includes the port's growth forecast for containers. And so in regards to the significant growth projected for warehousing, we recognize that, we see that, but we also recognize that it's a critical component for the goods movement market, but also needs to be mitigated when the impacts are significant. And just highlight that we see that there are a variety of solutions available today and into the future for localized and regional air quality.
Okay, thank you very much to all our panelists. We're going to take some questions now at this time. While we get set up here, I am always, as a journalist, wondering about projections. I remember I moved here in 2000 and saw a SCAG report on airport capacity, and it projected that within 40 years we would be out of capacity at Ontario Airport, we'd be using San Bernardino, we'd be using March, we'd be using El Toro, so obviously that's not the case. So projections are always something that 250% though really scared me. So we're going to start with that question about projections and how important or accurate are they. If Susan, if you don't mind a quick answer on that. And then also just a reminder on ground rules for questions. Keep your questions short. And again, this is not a referendum. We're not here, this is not a deciding body. So we're not going to talk about the pros and cons of specific projects. We're going to talk about issues related to public policy and clean air and those factors. So Susan, projections, we see these 250% container increases. I mean, is that even possible given all the goods that we already consume now?
The 250% comes from the port's, their own projection of cargo forecast, and takes into account the amount of cargo that can fit on the terminals as they build out their terminals. So that's their projection that we use. It's my understanding that the ports are working on a new forecast. We're not exactly sure what that forecast will look like, but the 250% is from the ports of LA and Long Beach, their own forecast.
Okay, from the audience? Sir, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Mike McCoy from Reno Valley, and I want to thank all of our speakers who brought up a lot of information. My question is about the appropriateness and completeness of EIRs, that especially the portion on the air quality analysis. Some of the things you discussed were very important to me and some of my causes, and it looked like the increase in concentration of air pollution so close to freeways, very important and kind of illuminating to a lot of us. My question would be, if the EIR does not include an analysis showing like the population and the effect of freeways and other pollution corridors close to the freeway, should the EIR include data on the number of people who would be affected within like 500 meters or 1 mile or something like that? And if not, would that constitute a possible shortcoming of the EIR? And be something we want to comment on when it comes out for some of the projects in the Moreno Valley area. Thank you.
What our agency, when we review the EIR, in terms of the health risk that's could be generated, let's say from a freeway or a highway, whether it's a roadway that's traveling to a certain facility, we ask that they do what's called a health risk assessment. And the health risk assessment will look at the types of sources, whether they're, let's say they're just diesel trucks, and we'll look at the surrounding receptors. So if there's homes or schools or other recreation facilities or that are around it. And so they'll have to do what we call air dispersion modeling to look at the concentration and calculate what the probability of a health risk is. And that's one of the things that we look at and we comment on.
Hello, my name is Susan Nash. I've lived in this area since 1980. And I also am very familiar with CEQA, and I'm an attorney, and I do a lot of CEQA litigation. And what I think needs to be talked about is the simple fact that growth is not sustainable, and the underlying assumption here is that growth is somehow sustainable, that the earth can just keep on growing and we can keep using up all the resources, and if we just manage it correctly, that's okay. And I think it does a disservice to the public to tell them that growth is sustainable. The second thing is that...
Do you have a question? Please ask your question.
Yes, my question is, how can you do this? How can we have, in a democracy, elected officials who can decide whether my grandchild lives or dies on the basis of balancing it against somebody's economic values? We know that we can make all the comments we want on the EIR, and that the elected officials can make findings of overriding consideration. You can have an EIR that says, how can we...
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. That's what happened last time. Nobody wanted to answer it.
I think someone can answer the question, the panel.
I just, when was it? About 10 years ago, I did a similar study, and I looked at a lot of environmental impact reports. Looked at the CEQA process that happened in Vero Lomo as it went from farms to warehouses, and as Susan said, most of those warehouses were approved without an environmental analysis or very sketchy when they would do an environmental assessment. There'd be no full-blown environmental impact report. Taking a look at that same process 10 years later, I found that there's a lot more environmental analysis that's being done now for these types of projects. But from what I know about health impacts, they're not, they don't go into all the impacts that are out there, and there's still ways to go for the environmental analysis to catch up with the health effect science, is what my observation.
Hi, my name is Kim Jones Johnson. I live in Silicon Valley. And my question is, if a housing tract is proposed immediately adjacent to a freeway, does the developer install an air filtration system that requires the homeowner to buy and replace the filters a useful mitigation measure?
Well, I think in terms of in terms of indoor air quality, depending on the quality of the air purification system and the tightness of the house, etc., that may well work indoors as a controlled space. The issue, I think, is what happens when you go outdoors or open the door or open the window. Because although we all spend most of our time indoors, in fact, the indoor time we spend is typically at relatively low ventilation rates. That is, we're not running around through the house, or we don't get away with that for very long before you tell everybody to sit down and take it easy. But outdoors, in the yards or around school, etc., where the air is not being filtered by this contained system, is where you have these higher ventilation rates and higher exposures. And so while it may work indoors, you still have the issue of what you're doing when you're outdoors.
Is it my understanding that you don't want to talk about specific projects?
That's correct. I mean, we can talk about issues around projects, but this is not a referendum on any specific project.
Issues around projects? Well, one of my concerns was the World Logistics Center proposed and the impact that it would have with surrounding areas, including Riverside. Because the folks out there told me that it would affect the city of Riverside also. And also, secondly, it seems like warehouses and vehicles are two of the main concerns with air quality, but as far as vehicles go, I don't know what the government or officials are doing to try to get people to better change to electric cars or hybrids, you know, because I personally myself would keep my gas, automobile until they come up with a reasonable alternative.
Susan, could you address that in terms of what other things are being done on air quality? I mean, we're focusing a lot on logistics here, but there's other facets too that I've mentioned in your presentation. Are we doing more on cars and trying to get fewer cars on the road?
I mean, definitely for passenger vehicles, I think you're seeing incentives not by our agency, but by the state to get the general public into electric vehicles and cleaner cars with, for example, Diamond Lane stickers as an example. And there's other incentives in terms of trucks that where I had showed the Prop 1B funds is not just specifically for San Bernardino and Riverside, but is a statewide program. There's other programs that are available for funding in terms of charging stations and things like that, natural gas fueling stations to help to bring that infrastructure in place and to get not only this area but the state into the path of clean air.
get around the corruption I found on the Air Quality Management Board. You know, I live in a community of Casablanca, okay? When AB 2588 came into effect, it talks about this, it was number one. But what happened was it was classified. You know, it was there was a polyurethane foam company in my community, and they were misclassified as being in compliance. You know, they were number one in Riverside as emitter of volatile organic compounds. It was number two in the state at the time. You know, when environmental justice came to be, it was to address the disproportionate bad air in minority and low-income communities. Again, you know, we got our representative, but
Please, in the interest of time and the number of people wanting to ask questions, please ask the question.
I understand. This is important, you know, because, okay, there was I just want to know the air quality management has done nothing, no outreach to my community. As far as, we were excluded from environmental justice.
Okay, I'm sorry, please ask a question, I'm sorry.
Okay, how do I get around this corruption? You know, I mean, we have no,
Okay, thank you for the question.
I think I'm not familiar with that particular Casablanca facility, but if we can exchange information and I can look into it for you and get back to you, I'd love to have the opportunity to do that.
Really, I would like paper to print this. I mean, you know, this is...
Okay, we could talk offline here, but I'm sorry, in a forum like this with a number of people, again, I ask people to please phrase your question. This is a forum about public policy issues, and we're trying to get as many people to be able to ask questions as possible. I apologize for being rude, but that's what the forum was designed for. Next.
My question addresses your initial question, which was forecast growth, specifically the Port of Long Beach. I'd actually heard with the widening of the Panama Canal that there would be a 30% reduction in the amount of traffic going through San Ysidro, which would be good for the Inland Empire, obviously, in there. But nobody mentioned that. I was just curious as to whether your forecasts had taken that into account and how the traffic, you know, to the East Coast would be directed via the Panama Canal.
The forecast is actually prepared by the Ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles in terms of the amount of cargo that they foresee would come to their ports based on how built out their terminals are and how many containers that they can handle. And so if they have information that would indicate that there'd be less containers because another port might absorb that, I would think they would have taken that into consideration.
Hi, thank you for making the presentation tonight. I do appreciate that. I'm Tom Thornsley. I'm from Reno Valley. Particularly like Ken's discussion on the welfare economics. I am a sole planner, and so it is good to see that non-material things are valuable and can be assessed. I'm assuming it goes well beyond just looking at air quality as to what can be assessed. But I'll keep on focus on the air quality, and I believe it was Soon Ash who talked about how when we have enough negatives in an EIR for any project that's being built, and the air quality cannot be mitigated, that there will always be a statement of right consideration, and the communities will forego further impacts. But with the sense of being able to do economic, welfare economic assessments and put values on it, obviously adding more solar panels.
So your question, please?
Is there a way to put a good valuation out there for elected officials to look at it and better analyze and maybe be held more accountable in the decision-making process? What do you think of that?
Well, I think we certainly have the tools to do that. It would require time and data collection and statistical analysis of the environmental impacts, and converting them into dollar terms. And there'll also be a lot of uncertainty around any such assessment. You know, as I said, we don't completely understand how the environment works or how the economy works. But nonetheless, we could come up with estimates that would reflect local population concentrations for what would be considered the bigger impacts that we anticipate from a large new facility. Whether or not that gets incorporated into planning is kind of, you know, above my pay grade, as they say. I would hope that it would, but maybe you might hear more about that.
Just to explain a little more about the CEQA process and our agency and our role is that we provide comments to the lead agency. So the lead agency, let's say you live in Moreno Valley, so it could be the city of Moreno Valley for the World Logistics Center as an example. And so our agency provides comments, and our comments are recommendations and suggestions. Our agency generally does not take any position in regards to a land use decision, but we may urge or strongly urge the lead agency to make recommendations in regards to their air quality analysis, additional mitigation to mitigate the environmental impacts. And it's really the decision of the lead agency and in terms of if they want to approve a project. And CEQA allows them to approve the project with significant impacts. It does have requirements to mitigate to the extent feasible, and there's specific language there, but they can have a statement of override considerations. We're more than willing, for any local government or planning agencies or, planning departments to provide additional information and education in the process in terms of what we're looking for, additional mitigation. We always encourage developers for early consultation with us so we can give them ideas. It's like if you're designing a housing development near a busy roadway, can you put the parking lot near the roadway and put the top lot on the opposite end? I mean, there's things that I think, common sense things that maybe, with the proper amount of education and just letting folks know, what our recommendations are that can be done. And we try to do that. So I totally understand your frustration. We get frustrated too, trying to advocate the position of air quality and public health. We understand from the community's perspective the frustration of certain types of impacts that could be impacting their home, their family. We get it. So
in essence, even with your agency, you make the comments, but there are mitigatable things, but
the lead agency can decide not to do them. Right, it's their discretion.
These are too expensive, we won't put the burden on, but yet they're doable.
Right, but the where the rubber hits the road is that if it is actually a feasible mitigation, somebody could litigate to require them to do that. So that's, yeah, something else.
I'm Dr. John Husing. I'm an economist who specialized in these areas since 1964. I have what I think is a very, very tough public policy question. There is no question, and I think it's been well documented today in the paper, that air quality is an issue, but it is also something that is getting better. The focus of my work is on another issue, which is on poverty, which is not just increasing in this market, but it is soaring. We have a 166% increase in the number of families below the poverty line. The share of the population that's poor has gone from 12% to 18% since 1990. We have the highest unemployment rate in the United States of an area with 1 million or more people. 28% of our job growth in the first 7 months of this year, 5,000 out of 17,500 jobs, was in logistics and distribution. If you take that away, we are not having, for all intents and purposes, any real job growth at all. Poverty is a public health issue. I'm about to ask him.
Yeah, please refrain from comments. I'll moderate.
You let him go on and on. Other people will
All right, please.
This is a forum, right?
Continue.
I was about to ask the question. Poverty is a public health issue in the same respect with lots of ramifications that you get from air quality. My question is this: if in the process of increasing the health that comes about from reducing the air quality problems, you at the same time are increasing the number of people who cannot get to jobs, what then is the appropriate policy to deal with poverty in this particular region where it is soaring?
Well, I guess my reaction to the question is that you've hit the nail on the head, which is that there are trade-offs. And I think that both sides need an equal hearing. And that we simply can't escape the fact that it's almost impossible to have it both ways, to have economic growth in the traditional sense without having measurable impacts on the environment. So it'd be great if we could have both. Everybody rich, everybody in a clean environment, everybody with all the goods and services they want. But the fact of the matter is that it usually doesn't work that way, and that we ought to be careful about how we do weigh the trade-offs. So I don't think it's a question of whether we disregard the environment and simply focus on poverty, nor do I think we should disregard poverty and simply focus on the environment. My stance, as I think is clear from my talk, is that I try to advocate for an objective, balanced approach that considers all the benefits and costs of proposed development.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up question on that, Ken. Then if we are overusing some resources in this market, then how do we get that in balance? You've lived in this region now for at least 10, 12 years. What are your thoughts on how we find a better balance?
Put me on the spot, huh? I think there's not an easy answer to your question. However, economists and environmental scientists, policymakers do have a number of tools at their disposal to address these issues. What we end up doing, though, is addressing issues in isolation, both because it's almost too complicated to try to address the overall growth of such a huge area and every aspect of it at the same time. But also because we find that we can actually say things that are meaningful and help direct growth in the right way by isolating issues and working on them individually. I'm actually currently working on a big project with colleagues at UC Davis about what the state of California should do about all the excess nitrogen that's emitted into the environment, not only as NOx, but also as nitrate, as ammonia, as all types of reactive nitrogen, because we have a huge nitrogen surplus. And I think in the end what we're going to find is that we're going to have to pick off the important issues and focus on them one at a time, because the type of modeling that you might have to do in order to say something about a region as large as we are and as diverse as we are, with all the activities in it and all the different resources in it, it would simply be too much to take on at one time. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think what I'm advocating is to break it down, tackle problems that we think that we can get our head around, and try to make progress in that manner.
We'll move on.
Hi, my name is Craig Gibbons with Concerned Citizens of Moreno Valley Advocacy Group. When I was looking at your presentation there, a couple of numbers stood out, and I'd like to ask a few questions about those numbers. You said that there would be a need for 412 million square feet more of warehousing. How many square feet of warehousing do we have now along the 215? Does anyone know that?
I don't know that. That forecast for the 412 million square feet comes from, it's another agency, SCAG, and in terms of their forecast based on the amount of containers and the amount of distribution centers and transloading facilities that would be needed. It's not to say that there would be 412 million in the eastern portion of the basin, but I think it's probably fair to assume that there would be a good portion.
So with that in mind, there was also a mention of, I think, 250% increase in containers.
Right.
So what I'm trying to do is get a visual. What is this area going to look like? Is it going to look like one of those hellholes around Los Angeles, around the 710, the Vernons, the Maywoods, those type of cities. Because I think if the people here have a vision of what this is going to look like, as opposed to what it looks like now, maybe there would be some pushback. So is it possible for your organization to give us a visual of what this expansion of the ports is going to look like?
I don't know what it's going to look like, but I can tell you that we don't want it to look like is that we, or not look like, but we don't want it to impact public health, and we want to minimize any public health impacts. We want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the region's ability to achieve what the federal government has established as healthful air quality standards for ozone and PM 2.5. And so that's why our comments to lead agencies, to cities and counties when they're developing warehousing projects or any project, housing, transportation, that we're asking for the same types of things, mitigation measures.
So in the future, is it possible for your organization to kind of give us an idea of where those warehouses, well, this 412 million creation of warehouses is going to be concentrated, and the type of infrastructure that there will need to be to move those 250% increase in containers?
Yeah, I have, I've only seen one cargo forecast that looks at, the potential build out of warehouses in the future, and that was part of the I-710 process. The I-710, they were looking at the potential for, where these warehouse distribution transloading facilities potentially could be. But they were also asking our agency, do we have more information, which, we don't beyond what SCAG has given us and what we've seen in either a NEGDEC, EIR, or, other transmittals from lead agencies, cities, and counties. So it's difficult to say. On that map that I had showed where it had the warehouse number, there were some little blue areas there, and it was showing the certain land uses that were currently unused that potentially could house warehouses and or other developments. And there's probably a fair portion of that that's more in the inland area. But our agency, just to reiterate, I think for Dr. Hughes' thing is that we're not against growth, and our air quality management plan it is growth accommodating, but at the same, on the other hand of it, balancing the economy and the environment. I've been with the agency for 23 years. It's a theme that constantly comes up. It's something that is very difficult. It's very important. We understand the importance of getting food on the table and for folks to have jobs, but also health and air quality are also important. And so that balance, and I think that in terms of, yes, there's a potential trade-off, but that trade-off is like, maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. It's about where you put the warehouses, and how you distance them, how you establish your truck routes, how clean you make your facility, ensuring that there's not trucks that are idling and sitting in neighborhoods. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done that are easy to do, and there's some things that can be done that are a little more difficult. But it's like, if you want that, this is what you need to do.
And I'm finding out this.
Okay, I'd like to move on to another. You can get back in line for more questions, but we like to have others get a chance to ask questions as well. Thank you.
Good evening. Simple. I guess the issue for me is sometimes where policy and practice kind of conflict. Starting with an observation that in the last 2 or 3 years, I have seen a major increase in people giving up automobiles and buying bigger and bigger trucks. And I understand from some of the people in my neighborhood that apparently that there's some program that people are using that it's supposed to be where they're getting incentives to buy some of these, not commercial trucks I'm talking about, like pickup trucks, but the bigger and bigger and bigger, and some of them are diesel and others are gasoline. I'm just wondering, is this another one of those cases where we have policy that is moving in a very different direction from where our practices are? Thank you.
question is without borders. And I'm wondering, is a local city council all-powerful? Can they make decisions that will then affect other communities nearby? And we have state laws, clean air laws, AB 32 and SB 375, which are mandating that we decrease certain emissions by a certain amount by a certain year. And I've seen the hard work that regional planning organizations are putting into meeting those requirements, state law. And so for our area, it's SCAG, Southern California Associated Governments, and they make very elaborate plans and they're working really hard to meet these goals. Do they not have any teeth to prevent a local city council from making a decision that would go contrary to meeting those goals? And what about other organizations like SCAG or EPA? Are there no teeth anywhere? Is the city council all powerful?
I don't know enough about SB 375 and all of that. I know that SCAG has responsibilities to establish guidelines for SB 375 in terms of, how cities and communities they plan. But I would not want to go down in terms of trying to, talking about their authority and their ability beyond that.
I don't think I'm going to answer your question, but EPA does have something called a Clean Air Interstate Rule that my understanding is they've tried to implement it over the years. It's been very difficult to implement it, but it seems that now it is actually going to be implemented. I think there was, I saw something in the popular press recently about the East Coast and how they're going to have to comply with this with the states being as small as they are compared to the airship. So, no, one state or one locality cannot just get away with, as you said, producing a global bad, right? Just considering what the local effect is. But the policy mechanism to implement such a rule is obviously going to be complicated. And I really don't know how it will be implemented, but I can at least tell you that people are thinking about it and trying to make progress on that type of issue.
I just want to add, there was a project approved by the County of Riverside called Villages of Lakeview between Paris and San Jacinto. And the city of Riverside sued over CEQA because the CEQA report, according to the city, didn't discuss the traffic impacts through Riverside, and they won. So, as far as environmental impacts go, the recourse in California uses the courts, and that's what happened. I don't know if that's the same kind of, this was an air pollution, it was traffic that they sued under, and they developed.
If you want to, Ian McMillan is in the back corner there. He might have a little more information on SB 375 that he can help you.
Okay, next.
Yes, my name is Danny Morales from Woodcrest. I live in Woodcrest, and I'm also a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee for AQMD. And I was asked by some residents of South Colton, because it seems like that area is zoned light industrial, and there have been attempts recently. They had a soil safe to start a hazardous waste dump there, and it was defeated along with the city of Riverside because it affects their water table. Now another business is coming in, and there was a protest yesterday there, and we observed so many diesel trucks going through there, and it's on Congress Street, and the kids walk those streets. You mentioned the mile from the freeway. This is on the sidewalk where the kids walk to school. And I really like Mr. Danielski's piece on the Press Enterprise, where the children are the most vulnerable. And that's what concerns me. It also affects the adults, but it really boggles my mind that the youth, nobody's thinking about them, Is there anything that can be done, say, with the amount of trucks that are already there and going through going through Congress Street, where it's a residential, and the kids walk through there to school. Is there anything that can be done to?
Good question. Can we also, are there other alternatives we can do in terms of perhaps whether it's truck traffic at night or during certain time periods or other things like that perhaps, I know there's a 710 corridor experiment, other incentives. What can be done to, help with those traffic patterns?
I don't have a complete answer for you, but I would just urge a note of caution in the port communities in Wilmington and San Pedro. The ports, the community was very concerned about the amount of traffic, the trucks coming through the neighborhoods. And so the port, an early response the port had was to extend the terminal operating hours, thinking that they could shift the traffic from coming through rather than having big pulses at certain hours a day, spread them out. And that way have lesser traffic over a longer period of time, making it less congestion, which did work to some extent in terms of trucks per hour. But the community found that what happened was then all hours of the day and night, they were getting noise and traffic. And at night, you may notice that it seems like noise carries further. You can hear things. And so they were finding that even though they did have the extended hours, they had the congestion sort of solved in the daytime. Now they have a bigger problem. They offset it by another problem, which was the noise of trucks coming through at night. And so sometimes what seems like, a relatively straightforward solution, that is just, extending hours to sort of avoid that pulse in the day, doesn't work quite so neatly.
Anybody else want to take a stab at that? No? Okay, next.
I thank my neighbor Dave for doing this. This is an amazing article and an effort. I applaud the Press Enterprise for doing this. I categorically reject the premise that we, in order to address poverty and unemployment, we have to accept foul air. When I was growing up in the state of Colorado in Denver, the governor came out with a statement saying that he was unable to recruit business to the state of Colorado and to the city of Denver specifically because businesses told him point blank that they would not locate their employees in our brown cloud. And he said that it was unacceptable and they were going to do something about it, and they did. They mandated scrubbers on the stationary sources, and they mandated alternative fuel during the winter months. We were there 3 weeks ago. The air is absolutely crystal clear. It is unbelievable. They have an unemployment rate that is less than the national average, and you cannot turn around in downtown Denver without seeing a crane on the skyline putting up a new building. We do not have to trade economic prosperity for clean air and clean water. So my question to you, if Colorado could do it 25 years ago, what are the solutions that we need to do? Taking it as a given that the ports are not going to go away. What are the concrete solutions? Because you're preaching to the choir here, you can tell. What are the concrete solutions that we need to press our elected officials for? Taking it as a given that suggestions and recommendations that can be brushed aside by negative decks are not going to work. And I throw that over to all of you.
So thanks, and it's a very good point, and it allows me to elaborate a bit more. Denver, you said Denver, right? They made investments, right? They incurred short-term costs, and they got a long-term gain from it, right? And I think that that's exactly where we ought to be looking. That if we look in the near term, we probably are going to see a lot of trade-offs. Whatever they invested in cleaning up the air represents money and capital that could have been invested somewhere else but wasn't. It's definition of a trade-off. In the long run, they bought themselves something really valuable, right? And so I think that we could do it too. We might face some additional challenges, like the mountains that bring us and that sort of thing. They do. I think the prevailing wind direction doesn't bottle them up like it does us. So we can do it as well. But we have to think of it that way, as an investment that people are willing to make for a future payoff. and we can't necessarily just look at it in the short run and take a narrow snapshot of what's going on.
In terms of, I think you asked, what strategies, what things can be done, is that I think, looking at what other cities or jurisdictions are thinking about and talking about, on the I-710 corridor, they're talking about a zero-emission freight corridor. Why does it have to stop at the 60 freeway? Why couldn't it continue to go east and have, something that could be seamless moving cargo out of the basin or, to distribution centers? I think in terms of what needs to be done is, we need to establish that infrastructure today. I talked about that in the presentation in terms of, it's like if anyone has an electric vehicle, then you always think, God, why didn't they put, something in the garage so you don't have to trench your own garage to plug your car in. I have an electric vehicle and it's like, we'd have to trench our garage, so we ended up just putting it in a 120. But, those are the kinds of things. It's like, if you're building these new things today, it's much easier to get the infrastructure in today than to come 5-10 years later and say, oh, we should have put the stubs in. Put the stubs in now. Have the CNG fueling stations, so it's accessible. So then when, the facilities come, then there's no question, the infrastructure's there and it's available. There's things that can be done, and some of the things, like I said, are the low-hanging fruit in terms of just the design of a facility. For a warehouse, design your gate so you're not queuing outside into the neighborhood. Design a truck route so you're not traversing through the neighborhood. If you have empty plots of land, it's like starting with a clean slate, it's much easier than infill. There's things that can be done and that we suggest and we recommend to lead agencies and cities and counties to do those things.
Go ahead. Yes, Kenny Bell. Thank you, President. The question I have is going to be pretty short. It's preface it with anything. But does the AQMD have any authority to enforce the rules?
We have authority to enforce our own rules. So we have rules that regulate stationary sources and some indirect sources and for toxics and criteria pollutants, and we have strong enforceability, comes from the Health and Safety Code. But in terms of, for individual projects that have mitigation measures, there's actually in CEQA, one of the requirements is that the mitigation measure is enforceable. And so the city or county is actually required to have it in some type of permit, conditional use permit, or some enforceable mechanism to ensure that that mitigation measure would be implemented. So if they commit to a 5-minute idling at their facility as a mitigation measure to mitigate emissions to call their project not significant, they're required to have some enforceable measure, whether it's in a permit to ensure that that will happen. So whether they call our agency the enforceable agency or the city or county is, it's their responsibility.
Perhaps I should have prefaced it. Going back to the reporting bodies of the cities or the county, if they don't follow your recommendations, they have their line of defense, the paid consultants, we're going to have this many jobs, which is no rules, I can lie about that. And there's nothing enforced, it's like it'd be a great thing if they said, we're going to have this many jobs, but they never seem to happen. But I was referring to cities and counties that they don't follow the AQMD rules and regulations. Is it the same thing?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what your question is, but if your question is that when we make a comment to a lead agency, a city or county we recommend, for example, that they have a 2010 truck fleet, let's say, for their project, then they can say, no, it's not feasible because we don't own the trucks. We don't have a lot in terms of to force them to do it, and it's a recommendation to us. But when we see another facility that does it, the other facility has demonstrated that it's feasible. So in terms of the legal leg, I think their legal leg becomes very weak in terms of their argument because it's already been demonstrated that it is a feasible mitigation measure. So even though they may say no to us, if someone were to go and sue them, we could point to say, but this facility here did commit to it, it is a feasible mitigation.
You know, I'm going to jump in and answer that as well, because on the edit board of the Press Enterprise, we see candidates come through from any number of different jurisdictions. Civic engagement is incredibly important. Knowing who you're voting for is very important. Having good candidates is so vitally important. And I think it's incumbent on anybody who wants to be engaged in our society to help ensure that we have good quality candidates making decisions for us, whether it's land use or whether it's policy. So, you know, I salute everybody who's involved in the civic engagement process. And, you know, it's essential. It's really important to be represented. It's important to be involved. So, you know, in some respects, we get what we vote for. Go ahead.
Guiding principles and initiatives. And what if a representative failed to implement it or could violate it? And you know that, well, another question is, 91 freeway borders my community, and then the railroad goes in the middle of it, and we have a toxic hotspot. They want to put a thoroughfare right in the middle of my community. That's another source of emissions. So, you know, that, don't they have to have a study to do that?
They should have, I don't know who, it's called the lead agency. The lead agency could be a city, an agency, a county. So the lead agency could be your city, or it could be Caltrans, or it could be Metro, I'm not sure. But the lead agency, the agency responsible for that particular project is who you should talk to. And if it is a CEQA project, definitely, you know, you can talk to us, make sure that we have the CEQA document. If we have the CEQA document, we will review it, and if there is any air quality impacts that are either not disclosed, or they're not using the right emission factors, or it's significant and they need to mitigate it, then we would provide comments to the lead agency.
What if I do if they fail to implement any of the initiatives or the guiding principles?
That was, I think, you know, similar to the other comments, is that they're required under CEQA, if their project is significant and they commit to certain mitigation measures, they're required to have that those mitigation measures are enforceable, and that they have some mechanism to ensure that those mitigations would be implemented. So, you know, that's one avenue. Yeah.
Morris Mendoza, native of Riverside, neighborhood of Casablanca. As the previous speaker was saying, you know, we live in an area that's right close to the freeway, right close to parallels the railroad. And like I said, I've lived here all my life, so I see the differences and lead up to the smog episode. In fact, I have an article there in 1978 about smog here in Riverside. But my question is, has there been a study, because the other day I was standing on the corner of Madison and Evans right by the railroad tracks, and I was there less than 40 minutes, and 4 trains. And I'm not talking Metro, I'm talking about 4 trains there. Traffic had to stop there at Madison, you know. Is there a study or some information on how much more increase we're going to have on that? Because it's becoming very unbearable. The train company has an advertisement on saying how it doesn't pollute because they have diesels and they run through there. But when there's that many cars backing up because of 4 trains in 40 minutes, that's a big issue. So I want to know if there's a study or where I can get information on how many more trains are going to go through there, and you know what the situation is for our residents there.
Okay, good question.
I'm not aware of any study. I think what we can do is, Ian, if you want to connect with him and get his information, and we can follow up.
I don't know if this helps, but my understanding is that right now we have about 80 trains a day that go through the inland area, and it's down from the pre-recession peak of about 100, and the projections are, and this is not me, my colleague Imran Dori told a story about the Colton Crossing, and he said that that we're within a couple of years we're going to be back at 100, and it's going to go up from there, as more goods come from the port. So, and I do know that cities, including Riverside, have responded with building more grade crossings, and it's very expensive to do. The city of Riverside has been successful in 3 recent projects, and that helps.
Right, and some rail lines are regulated more in terms of number of trains, and some are not. Metrolink, for instance, is restricted on number of trains, but some of the railways are not. Next question. We're running out of time here in this facility, so if we could get through these next 4 or 5 questions, that'd be great.
I have a quick comment and a question for Susan. I first came to Riverside in '95 from the UK, and I lived here for 3 years as a postdoc. I never felt like I wanted to come back. The air quality was appalling. I went to Australia for 10 years, and I came back, and I was amazed at the air quality improvement. And I know we've got a long way to go, but I'd just like to make a comment that the South Coast Air Quality Management District and the EPA have done an amazing job. And you have to put it in perspective. There's lots of other cities around the world that have terrible, terrible air quality, but at least there's really smart people working on the problems we've got here. Now, I realise that there's a long way to go. There's big pollution problems, but I'd just like to ask Susan, since you've made such big strides in the last 10 years since I've been away, what are your forecasts? I mean, where are you aiming to get to in the next 10 years?
I think we had a couple slides that showed that in 2012 we had 111 exceedances of the ozone standard. We need to get that to less than 3 to demonstrate attainment. We have a long ways to go. We know that the best strategy for this region is what we call a heavy NOx reduction, because that gives us the greatest amount of reduction in ozone and also will help us with the particulate. But it is very daunting, even for our agency and what we need to do. It's a very daunting task.
I just want to add that getting it down to 3 days is actually a requirement of the Federal Clean Air Act, which is federal law. So it's something that Congress and President Nixon decided needed to happen, and that law is still intact. It has not been overturned, although there have been attempts to do that. So that's kind of what we have to work with legally.
First of all, I want to say thank you to President Price. Everything that you said tonight is me. I'm wheezing a little bit. Chef Basil, conference chef in the state of California, record. I'm doing, wait a minute. Roll. Wait a minute. This is what happens to me when I'm teaching the kids in Marina Valley. You are correct about living close to the freeway. Teaching them how to cut, how to be a young chef coming up. I say every 10 to 15 minutes I have to stop, but sometimes, like I'm wheezing out, sometimes we have kids that have to do the same thing. So my question to you, and I use that term, roll, because I'm teaching them how to cut, I do some things. Young kids, they learn by song, but they have to stop because of the quality of air. And I'm having an asthma attack now. I know the doctor back there, I saw her picture if you're up here. What the people here tonight don't understand is when I have a cough, I know I'm 60, makes my heart beat fast, it makes the young ladies' heart beat fast. The question to you is, you were correct in your presentation. I have a right to live. That was your mission statement. Your information you gave, all of you, was excellent. I'm that kid that's now 60 that went through all that. My question is, and then you said 33, I think, trillion or $1 billion. How do we put a price for a young child might have the opportunity or not get the opportunity to reach my lead? You are right. People do have a right to have growth. How do we define the goal? You also stated, the young man up at the top said, we get what we voted for. But if we get what we voted for, but yet we have the
asthma and things in the valley area. How do we change that? How do we go back and try to undo those that we get to vote for? How do I go tell my young child tomorrow, I don't know if you're going to live 10 years? I don't know if I'm going to make it 10 years from now. I pray that I do. I pray they do. My question to you is, at what rapid pace can we try to have good clean air? Trucks and everything that you gave here, it's going to bring fumes. My question is, how do we cut that? How do we come together and have both? Or can we even have both?
We believe that you can, and it's it's really talking about the zero energy emission technologies, and that talking about much cleaner trucks, locomotives, cars. Mobile sources are definitely the line share in terms of the emissions, and the continued improvement for technologies even on our stationary sources. So it's, that improvement. The task is daunting, but it's not impossible. The technology is here, but it's just a matter of getting, for folks to actually use the technology and to commit to the technology for the manufacturers to make it on a broader scale. But it's doable, but it takes a commitment, not just our agency and the public, but it's the facilities, your warehouses, railway yards, everybody to commit to doing this. So.
Just one other added comment, that is that in the case of children growing up, because they're still growing, their tissues are still repairing as they grow. And so if we were to, I guess this is a plea to sort of, if you believe you want improvement, to push ahead for that as aggressively as you can. Because improving the air quality now will actually affect your child's growth in the coming years. It's not over. Just as no matter when you stop smoking, whenever you stop smoking, it's a good thing. Your lungs will start to heal to some extent. They're not going to recover completely. But stopping that behavior, stopping that insult, will be an improvement, just as improving the air quality for the child while they're growing will help them to grow.
We're going over time, so there'll be 3 more questions. I'm sorry, sir, but we're going over time.
Just 2 quick comments in response to the most recent question. The first is that I think economics does provide a framework to try to bring together these very disparate costs and benefits. The output of that framework then has to go through our political process, right? And at that point, that's where my expertise ends. And I'm just one of you voting on people, right? The other thing I want to respond to is, how do we place a price on the health of a young child? No economist is going to make that determination, but what we can do is look at the trade-offs that we all make every day, and we can infer what the willingness to pay for improvements in air quality vis-a-vis health impacts. So for example, I could choose to live closer to the coast where the air quality is better. I have to pay more for a house and I have a more difficult commute. I choose not to. I choose to live here. And I could be part of, right, and so do you. And that says something about our preferences, right? It might be kind of hard to accept, but it does say something about our preferences. And that's where economists can infer these values that people place on health effects, right? We are not making judgment calls about anything. We are not trying to impose what we think the value of a child's health is worth. We're actually looking at decisions that people make and inferring what the willingness to pay is for changes in health outcomes.
I'd like to thank you for the articles, and I'd like to thank the Press Enterprise for the articles and the very needed, and we appreciate it. I wanted to ask a question. Do you know if there are any plans to tax the users of the freeways and create a fund that would be available to people that live within 500 feet of the freeways if they choose to move, particularly with a high priority for families with small children?
I'm not aware of any such proposal, but as an academic, it's an interesting thing to think about because it's in line with the way that we price roads for getting from one place to another faster, right? We could also price roads for the external costs that you impose on others by using the roads. That's called congestion pricing, but it could also be used in the context of pollution damages. However, I'm not aware of any such proposal.
Have been proposals floated around that following transportation issues, and no one have been opposed that I know of having a container fee to the region to cover the costs of wear and tear on the roads. That's all I've heard of, but nothing's been implemented.
Has the state ever, or Caltrans ever been sued by anyone whose children are suffering from the effects of living adjacent to the freeway?
I just don't know the answer to that question.
I'm not aware. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do 2 more questions.
I'm sorry, that's really intrusive. Can you just wait back? Thank you, and good evening, and Dave, awesome. I hope you put some more plaques on your wall. And people say science is boring. This has been very, very informative, and obviously what we are seeing is science versus public policy instead of science helping to implement public policy. All 412 million square feet of warehouses don't have to go in one place. I think that's a consensus. And distribution centers, distribution hubs make sense. And I think that the Air Quality Management District would support, and when CEQA documents come forward, distribution centers that are balanced and spread out so that you don't have these high concentrations of the air pollution and so on. I think that if you are looking at public policy and you're looking at valuations and economic justice and environmental justice, that makes more sense on a very local level. And my question is, what is the status of the Alameda Corridor project? And are there any requirements for mandatory grade separations so that we are not sitting there watching these freight trains go by? And my personal opinion is that the guys that invented the piggybacks of the trailers for big rigs going on freight trains and the piggyback, I love those people. I think those people deserve a medal because they're taking that many more trucks off of the roads. But I think that the grade separations, Valley Boulevard in Colton is a classic example. Hunts Lane, they're working on that. When I don't see the grade separation happening, are there policies that are supposed to be implemented, and particularly for the Air Quality Management District, requiring those so that we don't have cars idling for 15, 20 minutes sometimes. And the limitations, I understood at one point that there was a time limit of how long the trains have to take to go through those crossings. Is that incorrect information or is that correct information?
I'm not familiar with any time limit for trains going through any type of intersection. I don't know if anyone else knows anything about that, but I can look and we can try to find more information if Ian can come to you in terms of getting your name and contact information on I would think you're talking about the Alameda corridor that would go east-west. Is that what you're referring to? Or
correct. There seems to have been a cone of silence put over that. It was a hot topic for quite a while, and now I'm not hearing anything about it, and there's no one coming out here talking about the Alameda Corridor project. So that's why I was curious about the status.
yeah, we can look into that and talk to ACTA and see if there's any thoughts about that. So Ian McMillan, he's with the South Passaic Hill get your name and contact information.
And that was part of the 710 corridor project too, yes?
That's separate.
It was separate, it wasn't
That's
another one?
completely separate, yeah. 710 corridor project is a freeway expansion project, and they're planning to put dedicated truck lanes, zero-emission truck lanes. And then there's the Alameda corridor, which is for freight trains that currently use that, which goes up parallels to Alameda Boulevard, and then, but kind of ends around the 63 lane.
All right, thank you.
Last question.
Does the AQMD liaison with the EPA, do you guys talk? Do you guys meet?
We talk, yes.
Okay. The EPA is saying we're supposed to get down to only 3 days of ozone incident, and we're at over 111. And they realize that the boats in the harbor, the trains and the trucks are a big contributor to it. How can they dare to say they are going to expand the port 250% if that's where a big part of our problem is coming from?
The growth in the port cargo, whether it comes to our port or another port probably in the nation would likely occur, would be my guess. But, you know, some of these sources are federal sources that we're talking about, locomotives, airplanes, ships. And so it's not just the responsibility of our agency. We put together, it's called the State Implementation Plan, which is the AIMP. But it's a coordination that we have to coordinate with the state for cars and trucks, and then with the federal agency for locomotives and ships and
Okay, is there a local or LA area EPA that I could call, talk to, email?
yeah, the local is called Region 9, and they're located in San Francisco.
Okay, so they're the closest one?
They're the closest one.
Okay, now San Francisco really going to care about us?
Well, they come down and they visit with us, and we have, you know, conference calls and talk to them, and, you know, I think they understand, I think they probably have satellite offices too.
Okay, so I could probably find them online?
Why don't you give us your information, and then we'll get EPA contact to you to make it easier for you.
Good, thank you.
So, Ian is the tall one, yeah, that looks like Michael Phelps in the back there, and he can, yeah, help you.
Were you going to say something?
I just was going to say the address is 75 Hawthorne Street, San Francisco.
All right, I want to thank everybody in the audience for putting up with me for the past hour and 20 minutes. We've got a lot of questions through. I know I can be rude, but it was to try and get more people through as possible. So thank you very much as the audience. I would like to thank Kathy Armstrong, already left, one of our projects editor who did an immense amount of work to fulfill this project, and Dave Danelski, of course, but I also like to thank our panelists, Tim, Ed, and Susan. Thank you very much. Obviously, this is a very complex issue. It's not going away. It's going to be here. We'll be doing more on this and other issues. So thank you very much, and have a good evening.